When I did episode 96, which was about how to make a living with martial arts and self-defense, I didn't expect there to be that much of feedback that came to me after the episode aired. So a lot of people had questions, wanted to know more about specific things that I mentioned there, ways to earn a living. And instead of answering all those messages, what I'll do instead is make a few additional episodes where I focus in on some of these things. So in this episode here, I'll talk about writing books, which is something that I've done for a while now and have been fairly successful at, if I may say so myself. And I will give a lot of both general information, but also very much very practical, nuts and bolts stuff that you can use for your writing every day. This is all me talking. Every writer is different, but I'll give you what works for me and then take whatever you can from it. You might have to adapt some stuff, not use other things, but at the very least, you know that this is a method that can work. So we'll get into that. I'll have a lot of links for you in the show notes, and stuff that I mentioned here, you'll be able to find there, and it'll make more sense, or it'll be easier to check out some of the tools that I'll mention, so you can actually use them. So I'll immediately get into it. So let's start with the first thing. You have to make a decision up front. So what will you do? Are you going to basically go with a publisher or independently publish? Publishing has changed very much since I started with it about 20 years ago. Things have changed rapidly and fundamentally. Now, back in the day, if you wanted to get published, you absolutely needed a publisher. Publishing independently, self-publishing was by far not an easy route to take, whereas now it is very much different. I've worked with a few publishers. I've worked with Paladin Press and Turtle Press before they closed up shop a few years ago. My experience nowadays is that for all intents and purposes, I don't see why I would go with a traditional publisher nowadays unless there was substantial money upfront. That is important. So that it would be worth the investment and potentially all the, let's call it hassles that can happen when you work with a traditional publisher. I'm not saying it's impossible, by far. There are people who still do it today. I'm just saying is that you have to go in with your eyes wide open. Now, there's a lot of stuff going on that front when it comes to contracts that you sign. For instance, publishers typically ask for right of first refusal, which means that, and this is just a boilerplate wording that you will find in those contracts, because you will sign a contract. Otherwise, you're not going to get a publishing deal. And it says that for your next book, we get the right to look at it first and then decide if we want to publish it or not. I got rid of that clause with my last publisher. Why? Because I write in all kinds of genres. I write fiction, non-fiction. I write my Boxing for Self-Defense book is radically different from my Best of Wim's Blog Volume 1, which is radically different from the Leg Kick book. And that doesn't work for every single publisher. So there is no point for them to look at my next book if it's absolutely not a fit for their company. So that is one of the reasons why I want to get rid of it. And there's a bunch of clauses like that will be in your contract that might seem not all that bad until things go wrong. Everything's fine until it is not. And then the contract is what matters. It gets to be very complicated, and you don't want to get lawyers involved because that costs a lot of money. And unless your book is like an absolute bestseller, you're not going to recoup that money anyway. So it tends to become a little bit difficult to avoid certain things if things go wrong. So that's why, for that and many reasons, I am not really advising anybody in 2022 to have a traditional publisher as your first choice. Independently publishing is so much easier now than it was when I started writing books, and it is by far the most profitable method of publishing. Now, many people think that if you go with a big publisher, they'll just do truckloads of advertising for you and marketing and this and that. Sometimes they do, very often they do not, especially if you are a new author. That there's just no incentive for them to do that. Why? Because they've got truckloads of other authors as well. So they can't do a big marketing campaign for everybody. So they typically don't. And your book is just released along with a bunch of others that month. And it's up to you to market it and to spread the word. So if you're going to do all the work, the writing, and except for publishing and putting it in stores and ebook shops and so on, in online retailers, the input of the publisher is relatively limited in the sense that whatever the publisher does, very often you can do by yourself or hire somebody for a fixed sum, a one-time sum to do it, and then have it done, and then move on to the next part of publishing. The reason why that matters is that typically a publisher gets a very large percentage of the royalties, meaning 70, 80% is not uncommon, and sometimes even more. So if they're going to get the lion's share of the profits, well, there should be something that is standing in, on, let's call it the balancing the scales, more or less, because you're going to do a lot of the work. And I can tell you story after story of authors who are basically then left to fend for themselves once the book was published, but the publisher still keeps all those big royalties. And they do so basically indefinitely, depending on where you live. It tends to be, if I'm not mistaken, it was 70 or 75 years after you die. That's when the rights revert to your whatever's left of your children, grandchildren, and so on. So that is just how copyright law works. Might seem strange to many people, but that's typically how it is. Now, you can try to insert a clause that limits the contract to a certain time period, like let's say 5 years, 10 years, which is you saying to the publisher, if you can't recoup your money in 5 to 10 years, then there's something wrong here. Then you're either not committed or you don't want to take the risk, fine. But then what is the upside for you as an author to keep going with a publisher until you die, and then afterwards they still have the rights? There's not really much financial upside for you, again, unless you are a runaway success from the get-go, or you bring in a massive audience to begin with. For most people in the martial arts and self-defense crowd, it's not going to be the case. So that's where I stand. So I am a big fan of independently publishing, which I've done for my last few books as well. It's a conscious choice. I decided to do that. And yes, it is more work, but there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to do it. If you can work with a word processor, an email client, you can get a book done. And the stuff you can do, you can hire people to do a one-time job for you, pay them once, and then you're done with it. And then you have the lifetime of that book, which means for however long it is in print, and nowadays that is always, because with ebooks and on-demand printing, books don't go out of print really anymore. So you can then simply recoup all that money over the period of years. And some books will recoup very quickly and start earning for you, and others might take a little bit longer, but you've got time because you own the rights to it, and you don't have to give up the vast majority of the royalties to your publisher. And the other reason is because I am very strong-willed and have strong opinions. I like to do things my way, so that also helps. So that said, you decide what is good for you. If you get a great deal with a publisher, by all means go for it. I would advise against it for the vast majority of new authors, and even authors who already have a fair amount of traction already with the public. But you do you. So let's move on to the practical aspects. What should you write about? This is a question that people ask a lot. How do you get your ideas? Ideas are cheap. Just like talent is cheap. It's the streets are paved with ideas. You can find them anywhere and everywhere. It's the execution that counts. So what does that mean? Well, you will be able to find new ideas and new thoughts and new concepts for books constantly if you're very much engaged into learning, practicing, teaching, and so on, martial arts and self-defense systems. There's going to be questions that you ask yourself, that people ask you, and so on, and then you can potentially have a book there with one of these ideas. The way Lauren Christensen, who basically took me under his wing and taught me how to write books, said is that it's kind of like there's always ideas bubbling up to the surface. And sometimes the bubble pops and there's nothing there. And sometimes, there's something there. And it gets you thinking in a different direction. And you discover that, okay, there's a book there, or there's a chapter there, or there is an idea. If you combine it with another one, that turns it into an interesting book. So all that is possible. The thing is to not force yourself like, oh, I absolutely have to have an idea for an awesome book. No, just what are you preoccupied with in your training? I am fortunate that I've been teaching for 30 plus years, both one-on-one sessions as a personal trainer, but also my group classes, seminars, online classes, Zoom classes, and so on. So I get a lot of questions, which often give me ideas for books. I also have a lot of interaction with other people where I can see that when I'm teaching, like, okay, what works, what doesn't work. So, and that always, when I see a student having issues with something, then I have to find a way to teach it to them correctly so they can do it. And that often inspires an idea like, okay, I'm going to write about this. Another way you can do about it is start a website and write a blog, which I've been doing for 20 plus years. And that's actually how I got started, because Lauren asked me, you want to write a book together, after reading some of my stuff on my then website, but now we call it a blog. But back then they didn't call it a blog. That term didn't exist when I started. And if you write a lot of articles, just to practice writing to begin with, but also to get some exposure, to get some feedback from people who read your stuff, and to also, bit by bit, maybe start to develop a little bit of a following, an audience that might be interested in your book. You're going to have to do that anyway. You're going to have to market it anyway. So might as well combine stuff. And you just write things, and when something connects with the audience, then you might actually have a book idea on your hand. For instance, for a long time, my can boxing be used for self-defense blog post was one of the top articles on my blog, where people just every day massively came to visit that. Okay, well, it was clear there was an interest, so I wrote a book about it, and it's going to be a multiple part series. It's going to be easy. It's going to be at least 3 books, maybe even 4. So there's clearly an audience for it. And to date, this is my best-selling book. So ideas come constantly if you are just letting them happen. And most importantly, I believe, write them down. Note them down in your phone, in a special document that you keep with you on Notepad. I don't care. Write them down and keep them. What often happens is that if you keep them and then you don't think about them, and after a while, and then X amount of time later, you read them again, stuff that you might have forgotten, and an idea that you recently had, if you mix them together, all of a sudden you've got this thing on your hands that might work. So ideas, there's plenty of them. You just have to be open to receiving them. But then you get to decide, what do I write about? Okay, I've got that. Okay, so what kind of book do you want to write? Now, I make a few categories. There's different ways to view this, but this is how I see it. The first thing you can do is write an instructional book. That's my heavy bag book, my leg kick book. Those are instructional manuals, like you buy a new appliance. Okay, well, how do I work with that? Same thing, you want to do a leg kick. Okay, how do you do that? Instructions, step by step. This work on this part, work on that part. How to put it all together, some nuts and bolts, some general principles, common mistakes. That's an instructional book. The heavy bag book is the same thing. How can you train with the heavy bag? Okay, here's a bunch of chapters showing different ways of doing just that. These tend to be typically relatively successful, and I'll write more about your audience. I'll talk more about the audience that goes for that. But these, in my opinion and in my experience, they tend to do reasonably well. Next up, you have conceptual books. For instance, my Timing in the Fighting Arts book that I wrote together with Lauren, it's about timing. Timing is a concept. It's not something you can just put in a box. It's a concept that has wide implications on martial arts self-defense and anything to do with that, right? So we wrote a book about things that have to do with that. It's different from purely an instructional manual because there's not necessarily a given specific technique or set of technique that you're talking about. You have to give some theory, you have to give drills, practice, you have to give maybe a little bit of the science background, which is very different from a typical instructional manual. Another category of books is stories or history books. For instance, my Best of Wim's blog, Volume 1 book, is basically a collection of blog posts and then a bunch of new ones, both from me and from other authors, that I just compiled together. It's a compilation of different things. The way you can see that is like a buffet. You buy the book, that's like buying the buffet, and today you read a few stories, and that's like eating some stuff that is in the buffet, and the next day you eat something else, you read a few other stories. There's no need to read everything from A to Z, right, one day after the other to complete the book. You can pick it up anytime and read something else. There's a really good book in that vein as well that I like, which is more history. It's a combination of stories and history, and it's Aikido Masters, Volume 1, The Pre-War Students of Morihei Ueshiba, the founder of Aikido. It's by Stanley Pranin. It's an older book, and he talks to the students of the founder of Aikido from before the Second World War. And he interviews them, and they talk. Fascinating book, really interesting. So these kind of books tend to sometimes do well, especially if there's like a big audience for them, and there's millions of Aikido practitioners. So that book did well, obviously, for that reason, and people want to know about the history. So you could definitely write some of those as well. Another one is a principles or skills book, and a good example of that is that one, the one from the late Bob Orlando, Indonesian Fighting Fundamentals, The Brutal Arts of the Archipelago. And again, all the links are in the show notes, which is talking about the fundamental principles of Silat and Kuntao. And he talks about principles and explains them and then shows examples of them with techniques. So it's not necessarily about one concept, it's not necessarily about a technique as such, but it's more about how does all this stuff work. So that's more high-level stuff, the principles underlying fundamentally everything you do in a given art. These books can be successful, but I found that typically it's more advanced students that read them. Why? Because you have to have some experience to understand and actually see those principles in action. Beginning students often don't get that at first, simply because they haven't trained long enough and haven't advanced enough in the system to see enough information to get a little bit of an overview so they can actually see that these principles are at work. You can explain them from the get-go to new students, and they can maybe recite them, but they don't necessarily understand what it means. So that's why I think often beginning students don't necessarily go to these books, but intermediate and advanced students prefer them often. Then the final category that I think is valid to talk about is translations. There's the Book of Five Rings, The Art of War, the Bubishi. There's a bunch of classical books written in Chinese, Japanese, and so on that you can translate. A relatively recent one from Chris Wilder, Sun Tzu said, Classic Warfare for the Modern Mind, which is looking at the writings of Sun Tzu, and the historical figure Sun Tzu is something else than the author, but we're not going to get into that, and look at what is written by him, and then translate it into, okay, how can you use that today? So these are very interesting books. Why? Because today will always change. You write about 2022 when I record this. If you write the same book in 2032 or 2042, it's going to be different because society will have changed. So these are some categories that I think you can definitely look into. And maybe you always write the same thing. There's people who are very successful only writing instructional manuals. And then there's other people who really like to write more conceptual books and are successful with that as well. You do you. Try both. Try all of the categories. See what you like. See what you feel works best for you. Being a writer is first and foremost a process of self-discovery. It's figuring out what you want to write about and how you want to do it. Now, moving on to practical stuff. So how do you organize things? I think you need to organize your writing, the Word documents or the whatever word processor that you use, the actual files on your computer, organize them. Why? Because writing can take a long time. My first book took about a year to finish, and there was 2 of us writing it. And what you write in the beginning, it's hard to keep track of everything a few months later, let alone a year later, let alone 5 years after it's published, and you want to go back to it and write a sequel, or you need to look something up. So organize it. What do? I have a folder on my hard drive on my computer, and I have tons of backups, different kinds of backups on different devices and online as well. I make a folder for my writing, subfolder for an individual book, and then a bunch of different subfolders as well. And I keep copies of each version of each file that way. What does that mean? Well, I'll first go over the other stuff, and that is I have a folder for promotional material. So when I will make ad copy or promotional copy for posting stuff on social media, images to use from the book and so on. I have a folder for the cover so that I immediately can look for it and when I'm working on the cover, add files there. Then there are 2 folders. There's one for the ebook version, the digital version, all the files go there, and one for the paper version. These are different files. I'll talk about that in a bit. And then I have a folder for pictures and illustrations, and they have subfolders as well. Depending on what kind of book it is. If it's an instructional book, often I have a subfolder per chapter. Chapter 1, all the pictures there, they are numbered and labeled. Chapter 2, a subfolder, and so on all the way until the end. There's one folder for me that I always use for sources. And that's just my method. When I have an idea for a book, I make one big file and I copy and paste some text and thoughts or quick sentences that I write for something that I think I might want to include, links to articles about something that's relevant to that book ID, and that's just basically brainstorm stuff. And I put all that stuff in there, so I never have to look for it. Sometimes it can be a picture that I take with my cell phone, and I put it on there, or that you see on the internet, you download it and you put it in there, just so that you have something that you can look back to. When you start writing, like, okay, I took this picture a year ago. What did it look like again? Okay, I'll look again, right? And now you can continue writing. And then we get to the actual part, and that is, so in the main folder, I have one file. I used to have a file per chapter. I found that to be a little bit more complicated to, I always had to switch files all the time. So what I did, I have one big file for the book, and then I use the navigation pane, which is a feature in Word. If you go to View in Word and then click on Navigation pane, on the left side of the screen, it will give you chapters. And you can actually subdivide that and organize your book that way. And then when I'm writing, I want to work on chapter 5, I click in the navigation pane on chapter 5, and immediately Word jumps to that page. That's what I do. So I start writing. I write the book until it's finished, and that goes into a subfolder called RC1, Release Candidate 1. Why? Because I'm a nerd, and that's kind of stuff I like to do. And that is all first draft. And I'll talk about that later, but first draft is done. When I get back to the second draft, then there's a subfolder called Release Candidate 2, and that's where that one goes into. Now, I don't just drag the same file from folder to folder. I have my document in Release Candidate 1, I copy it and paste it in folder release candidate 2, and then only work on release candidate 2. Why? So that way I have a previous version that I can look at. Sometimes you will end up cutting, deleting stuff, and then like a month later, you're like, maybe I need to put it back. What was it again? But it's gone. Go back to release candidate 1 and go look at it there. It's very difficult to recreate something from memory if you've been writing a book, because you write so much that it's hard to keep it all in your head. So eventually you'll forget stuff or get it wrong. So having all these different iterations of the book just on your hard drive makes life so much easier. When I'm done with that second draft, I'll start working and so on. And then I have a different folder called Release to Manufacture, RTM, which is the stage at which the book is getting pretty good. And that's when I work on adding all the details. That's where the fully copy edited version goes into. All the proofing is done, looking for typos, looking for grammatical mistakes, and so on. So if I send it out to beta readers, their feedback is incorporated in that document. So that's basically getting really close to the final document. I use that one to add pictures and illustrations if need be, and basically finish the book. And then I copy that and put it into a different folder called Gold. And that is when that is ready for release. That is what's going to be published. So when everything is said and done, in that folder, that subfolder, the Gold folder, that's where the final files are. That is what is going to be uploaded to wherever you publish it or what is sent to the publisher. You don't have to do it that way. I do it that way because then I always have step by step, I can see how the book evolved. And I can't tell you how many times it happened that I have a certain structure in mind, I start working with it, and then after 5 months I figure out like, no, I need to change the structure a little bit, and I need something that I deleted. Okay, just go back and read the first draft, and like, it's right there. And then you can keep going. So organization makes life easy in the long run. When you look back at something that you wrote 10 years ago, it's going to be difficult to remember why you wrote certain things, but you still have this track record of everything, and that's why I think it matters. So you're organized, you're good to go, you've got your ID, right. What do you do next? How do you start writing? Well, you could start writing, but I think that's not necessarily the best way to go. There's two main categories of writers that are often called either gardeners or architects, or pantsers and planners. Somebody who writes by the seat of their pants, and somebody who plans ahead. Somebody who's a gardener who just lets it grow and prunes and trims some hedges here and there and organically lets something be created, or an architect who makes detailed blueprint plans and then builds. You're actually going to do both. You will be very creative at certain points, and then very methodical at other points in the writing process. And there's a balance that each writer gets a little bit different, and that's fine. Me, for nonfiction, because that's what we're writing, for nonfiction, I think being a planner is the best approach. Because if you are all over the place, how do you expect your reader to keep up with you? So that's why I like to plan. And as you've just heard, the way I organize all my files for my books are pretty much well planned. The same is something that I do with the writing itself. So before I start, I brainstorm, and I put everything I can think of on paper in writing, and just brain dump all that stuff into one file. You can always cut stuff later, you can add stuff, you can change it, but first get it out of your system, get it out of your head, so you can start seeing all the elements that are involved. How long does that process take? It depends. It can be a few days, can be a few weeks, can be months. I've got book IDs that I've been working on for 10 years, and they're not critical in the sense that I don't necessarily have to write it right away, but it's a book ID that I think, you know, that might be something good that people might enjoy reading. And I just work at them a little bit every now and then. And when something hits me, I'm teaching a class, I get a specific question, I read something, I see a video, whatever, and there's something there that fits into whatever that book ID is. I just note it down, add it to the sources file, and organically something starts to begin to take shape. And eventually that makes it into a book. The other way is that you have a book ID, you're very enthusiastic about it, and then you do what I just said, do a massive brain dump and just try to every day work at it until you think like, right, I've got enough now. Or I think I've got all the essentials and I have enough to start writing. When is that? That's different for everybody. But write it all down. And then the next part is structure. If you write in a disorganized manner, it's going to be very difficult for the reader to understand and learn from you. Many readers, they just stop reading if it doesn't make sense or it's hard to follow. So the easiest way to lose your reader is not having any structure in your book. Because in chapter 1 you write about one thing, and in chapter 2 you write about something that seems to be completely unrelated. And chapter 3 is a different thing as well. And chapter 4 is actually going back to chapter 1. It's hard to keep up. You need structure for a non-fiction book. You need it for fiction as well, but those structures are different. So what does structure mean? Well, what would be, how many chapters do you need? You look at all the stuff from your brain dump and like, okay, how can you organize that into different chapters that make sense, put things together where they belong together? And then which of these chapters do you want to include? Maybe there's a chapter that might be very interesting, but it's not really a good fit for that book. Maybe for a second book on the topic, but not the first one. Okay. So which do you include? What is all the content that goes in those chapters? Again, take your brain dump, organize it, and be picky as to what goes where. Sometimes there will be overlap, sometimes not. Make decisions. And then in what order do the chapters go? What do you bring first? What comes next, and so on. Typically, something that I took from Lauren is an introduction, and then a chapter called Nuts and Bolts, which is a bunch of stuff that doesn't necessarily take an entire chapter to explain, but it's before you get started with training and practicing what is in the book. You need to know this first. Some basics, some fundamentals, and so on. And a number of ideas, concepts, and information that you need before you can make sense of it all. So once you have your structure, then you can start writing. Now, everybody writes different. I've written parts of a book by hand on paper, surrounded by 50 plus people in Portugal in a doctor's office where a bunch of athletes needed to have a physical test done. And it was like 12:30 almost, and there was a lot of noise. And then I've written in total quiet, where nobody's around me, and I isolate myself. Figure it out. Give it a try. See what works for you. Eventually, you'll find out what that is. But you start writing. Okay, what do you do? What's your mindset? Well, I think the most important thing is to be yourself. Don't lie to your readers. Be honest about who you are, what you do, what you know, what you bring to the table, because they want to hear your thoughts. That's why they bought your book. So readers can actually tell when you're faking it. So don't fake it. Just be yourself. There's a lot of people in the world, billions and billions of people. There will be an audience for your book if you don't fake it. If you write in a voice that is not your own, it's going to be difficult to connect with your reader. So be yourself. Second point, I just said it, find your voice. Finding your voice means is just all the details of how you write. What is the tone? What kind of grammatical structures do you like? What kind of comparisons do you use? Stylistics choices and all these kind of more technical things that make up that when you write a book, somebody starts reading, they don't know it's yours, that they recognize that it's by your hand. You very often see this, for instance, in fiction, it's easier to see. You can recognize a book by Stephen King, perhaps a little bit easier than one by Sartre, which is totally different. So finding your voice takes time, and it takes writing a lot. Now, What you'll see is that your voice also changes over time. As you mature as a writer and you get more experienced, you will write differently from what you do in the beginning, and that is as it is supposed to be. But do try to find your voice. It's okay to imitate people and take left and right from different authors and copy their style, but eventually you're going to have to figure out what yours is. And again, that's a process that takes time, but it is important. It's going to help you connect with your reader and keep them interested. The most important thing, be clear. Clarity of writing is critical in a book that is trying to explain anything to do with martial arts and self-defense. Why? Well, you don't know your reader. They don't know you. Don't make it too difficult for them. Don't assume they understand your thoughts. Don't assume that they understand all the things that you say just because you know them and you've known them for years, because that's how you learned with your teacher or in your system. For instance, you can use jargon and nomenclature, typical expressions that are common in your style or with your teacher, and somebody from a different art has never heard of them. And if you don't explain them, they're like, what is this? And then they have to start looking it up, and maybe they'll find it, maybe not, but it pulls them out of your book. Every time your reader puts the page down and closes the book or shuts down his application for his e-reader, you've lost him. Your job is to do such a good job writing that he wants to pick it back up again. Anything you do that achieves the opposite result is not necessarily good. He might want to think about certain things and put the book down for that reason, but he also needs an incentive to come back to it. Don't make your reader jump hurdles. Try to avoid it. Sometimes it's difficult depending on the topic of your book, but try to make it as clear as you possibly can, because that way it's easier for them to keep on reading and understand what you mean. Another one, this is practical, avoid absolutes. As they say never or always. And I do get the irony of saying it that way. The point is that I've mentioned this before. My Facebook group is called Aries. Why? Well, you're not the god of war, Aries. That's not you. That's not me. That's not anybody. Nobody knows everything about violence, self-defense, martial arts. So if you start writing stuff like always or never or do this or this is the best way of and so on, you're just saying like, this is how it is. There is no exception possible, which is nonsense because you weren't there throughout human history for every single violent encounter. There's many things that you might think are impossible that later out turns to be something that actually happened, or that other people can do routinely. For instance, one of my blog posts that I wrote a while ago was, martial arts self-defense myths or street fighting myths, I don't remember, and it was about high kicks don't work in the street, which is something that I heard for decades from all sorts of people who should know better. And I'm like, I use them, I know other people who use them. Here's a video of somebody using a high kick in a street encounter. How can you say it doesn't work? When you say, well, it's not a good idea to do them for this and this reason, or for most people it's not a good idea to use a high kick, that's something else. That is a far cry from saying never, or it doesn't work, or this is how it is, that stuff doesn't work. You are not God, you're not the authority, the ultimate authority of martial arts and self-defense. So don't write as such. If you do, again, you will lose readers because they're like, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about because I did that, or my buddy did that, or I just saw a video on YouTube, somebody doing that. So being nuanced, I think, is the way to go. That brings me to the next one, which is similar. Don't be humble. Again, don't be a blowhard because readers don't tend to like it. And like I said, you don't know everything, so don't pretend like you do. A little bit of humility is fine. You can be proud of your achievements. It's fine, and you can write about them, of course. But if you come across as this guy who knows everything and it's like, oh, look at me, look at how tough I am. There's about to be a bunch of people who are a lot tougher than you are. So That's a contest you can never win. And we all get old and frail eventually, so eventually you won't be as tough as you used to be. So why write as if you are? Which brings me to, who are you writing for? Many different answers to that question. The main one is, you want to write for an audience that will buy your book. Now, if you take all the people in the world interested in martial arts and self-defense, that's a big number. If you focus in on those purely interested in self-defense, that's a smaller number. Some people just train for fun, some people train for health, for sport, and self-defense is just a byproduct. And then if you look at people who are interested in self-defense from an Aikido perspective, karate perspective, Kung Fu perspective, Krav Maga perspective, doesn't matter. It's a smaller audience still. So the more you drill down on a specific thing, typically the smaller the audience gets. That is not necessarily a bad thing, because there is crossover between audiences, but you do have to understand it. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is, who tends to buy books? This is something Lauren told me, and I think he's right. It tends to be the orange belts. What does that mean? It's the people who have been training for a little while, but not like 10 years, and they're still very motivated and want to learn, and they are looking for information. Nowadays, there's a lot of information on YouTube, the internet, and so on, and social media, but books are still a very valuable source of information. So the people looking for it, they are more likely to read a book, buy your book, than somebody who's been training for 20 years and actually knows a lot of that stuff already. So I would, for instance, give you the example of my Boxing for Self-Defense book. For me, that is a very basic book, especially the first volume is very, very basic information. It's some of the stuff that you learn quickly when you go to a boxing gym. But if you haven't boxed before, it's going to be new to you. On the other hand, people who have a lot of experience boxing, sports boxing, but don't have experience using that for self-defense, well, to them, a lot of the content in that book is also new. So you see what I'm talking about here. I'm focusing on a specific group of people who are looking for information, specific information. So that's a lot of general stuff already that you need to think about. Next one, I'll give you 3 quick tips, quick wins that you can use. So especially if you're writing instructional material, think of pictures and illustrations from the get-go, because it's going to change how you write. You can replace a whole written page with one picture if you do it well, and save yourself a lot of time. I'll get into making pictures in a little bit. So that's one tip. Second tip, reread what you wrote last before you start writing again. Maybe it's just a few sentences, maybe it's a few paragraphs, maybe it's an entire chapter, but read it again so it's fresh in your mind, even if it's the day after. Then focus and think about, what do you want to get on the paper right now? Focus on that, and then you go. It's basically getting yourself used to finding the right mindset to write efficiently, as opposed to just staring at the screen, typing away, and deleting your first sentence 50 times before you get going. Just get yourself in the right headspace. Now, one more tip that I found very useful is, once you get into the right headspace, start writing, but don't look at the screen. Just look at your keyboard, and you keep writing, and you go as long as you can to get all the words that are in your head out. And you'll notice that you write relatively quickly. But again, don't look at the screen. You don't care about typos and all that kind of stuff. You can fix it afterwards. Don't do the typos, don't structure paragraphs. Get it all on paper first. And then all of a sudden you're going to be like, okay, I'm spent. That's all I have for this here. And then you look at the screen, and then maybe you rewrite a little bit and fix it. And then you do the same thing for the next thing you have to write. Those tips tend to speed up your word count per day a lot. Right, so next point, as promised, pictures and illustrations. I've pretty much always done the pictures for my books myself, because I'm used to it, and I do have a fair amount of experience. But it's expensive if you want to get a professional to do it. Even an amateur photograph is going to charge you. So, and if they're new to the martial arts and self-defense world, they might not do a good job, or it's going to take them a while to figure it out, making the cost go up. Nowadays, you can mostly use a decent cell phone and get good quality pictures, like high resolution 4K resolution or up, where you have high detail to make pictures that can work in a book. So I put a link in the show notes with some photography basics. If you're new to it, just read that. But know that there are tons of books and other material about making good pictures that you can find. I'm going to focus more on some practical tips now. So first one, always take pictures in color. For print, you will turn them into black and white, and there's free software editors that you can use. You can use Photoshop, but there's a bunch of free software editors that I use. I use paint.net, it's free and it works fine. You use black and white for print, and you use color for ebook. Why? Because it's going to be very, very grainy when you look at pictures that are put in the paper version, because the quality is going to be much lower than an actual digital file. The reason is you can use color pictures in books, but it's very expensive. It's going to drive up the cost tremendously of your book. So the price of your book will be higher, and your royalty will not necessarily be bigger because of the price. It's just going to be expensive to make it. So overall, I would very much recommend against using color for paper books. For the cover, yes, not for the pictures inside. For the ebook, color, yes, because a digital device can show you the colors just fine. It's not going to be an issue. For those color pictures for the electronic version, resize them for reduced file size. Now, depending on where you publish, there's going to have to be certain guidelines, like you have to be X amount of dots per inch, minimum resolution will be this or that. Keep that, make sure that that's okay, but try to resize the picture so the file size goes down, because one picture can easily be several megabytes, and if you have a bunch of pictures, you can have a file that ends up being hundreds of megabytes. And then, for instance, Amazon will charge you a delivery cost to send your ebook that a reader buys on their store, your book, to send it to their phone, to their Kindle device. They're going to charge you for it. So make it as small as you can without losing too much quality. That's going to take some experimenting, but it's perfectly doable. Next tip, make the picture a little bit bigger than what you need. So when you look at the picture frame, what you see in it, zoom out a little bit, take a little bit of a step back so you have a little bit more in the image than you actually need. You can always crop it later. Really good photographers don't need to do that. They can, and as you get more experienced, you might not need to do that. But cropping something that you don't need is so much easier than trying to add something that isn't there. If you're too close and you actually need a little bit more distance, you're going to have to do the photo shoot again, or at the very least that picture. And you don't want to redo photo shoots. It takes so much time and energy. Another one, go for a light background. It doesn't have to be white, but not dark. And you also use clothing that is going to contrast both the background, but also what the other partner is wearing. If you're both in black uniforms, it's going to be difficult to see which arm is in front of which leg and so on. It just, especially in the paper version, it won't be clear. So figure out the clothing so that there's some contrasts with the background, but also the other partners. And also a dark background in the paper version. That means using a lot of ink, and it tends to make the picture not that great. A white background is so much easier to print, and it's going to end up being a better picture in the vast majority of the cases. Some more practical stuff. Don't use fast movement. It's hard to get a good picture of you throwing a fast punch or kick or doing a throw with somebody. Unless you're really good, or you hire a professional or a good amateur, it's going to be difficult to get the exposure of the camera right and get a really decent picture. Some people can do it, but if you're a beginner, I wouldn't do it. Just pose for the pictures and then, keep going with that until you get to the end of the photo shoot. Another aspect of that is think of where the camera is. When you're showing something, don't hide important points from the camera lens. The camera, as I record this, if you're watching me on YouTube, is facing me dead ahead. If I put my right hand in front of me and I put my left hand behind it, the camera doesn't see what my left hand is doing all that well. So think in that way when you take pictures. Don't write about stuff in your chapter where you say, look at picture 15A and look at the left arm, and the reader looks at it and he can't see it because the demo partner's body is in front of it. So you have to think about what you will show in the picture, and your writing is going to change along with it. And that is what I said earlier, is that if you have pictures, your writing will change. What else is important? I'm just going over my tips here. I always have my draft with me, or the final draft, or whatever, whatever I'm using at that point, because sometimes I do improvised photo shoots to see what it looks like. But typically when I get to the last part, so release to manufacture, then I have the final file, which is basically ready to go with me. And then I go through every chapter where it needs pictures. In my draft, there is constantly somewhere between brackets written insert picture 1 or insert picture 1 to 3 or whatever. And then I just do a search function, Control F in Word is that, and I type insert, and every time it will automatically show me, okay, this is the text that is where I'm going to add pictures. Why is that important? Just quickly read what is there, because again, you're going to have so much to do, technically speaking, setting up the photo shoot, and it might have been a month or 2 months since you last wrote that you need to make sure that the picture that you take actually shows what the text is has written. Very easy to make mistakes, very easy to leave out certain details that you actually want to put in there. And then if you don't, and that happens enough times, either you're going to have to redo the photo shoot, or you're going to have to change your text and write again and get it edited again and proofed and so on. So take a minute to read what is on the page, and then tell your demo partner, like, okay, hold your hand like this, throw the punch here, keep your hand there, and I'm going to show the technique, and you snap the picture. And then two more, lighting. Good lighting is key. There's a bunch of articles that you can find online about lighting, but bad lighting messes up everything. It creates shadows on the wall. You can have overexposure, underexposure that messes up the picture quality, and so on. So figure out shadows and lighting first, and then start taking the picture. You can do a few tests. That is, like I said before, sometimes I do a test shoot with a demo partner, just in front of a wall, use specific lighting, see what happens, and I'm like, okay, this sucks, I'm going to have to do it differently. But I look at that picture on my cell phone, on the big screen, on my laptop, and I figure out how do I have to do the lighting. Don't do it afterwards, meaning don't do the whole photo shoot and then think, and now I'm going to see if the lighting was good. No, don't do that. All right, enough about pictures. Let's move on to rewrites. So you finished your book, it's done. It's never done after you finish the first draft. We like to think so, and often, especially with me, I'm like, I can't stand the book anymore after so many months of writing. But leave it for a few weeks or maybe a few months. Don't look at it, don't, just leave it alone. This is also when you might want to send it out to beta readers, and they will read it and give you input. And eventually, after a while, then you start again. And it can be a few weeks, can be a few months, doesn't matter. Or you have like 5 readers who will give their input, or 10, wait until all that information is back. And then you start rewriting. There's a phrase in writing called kill your darlings. I use slaughter your darlings because you don't want to be precious as a writer. And you have to understand that what you think was so awesome actually might be really crappy once you read it again. And it was like 6 months when you first wrote it. and you've forgotten about it, and then you read it, and a beta reader points out like, look, this actually doesn't make sense because of X, Y, Z, and then you go like, how could I have been so stupid? That happens all the time. So you're going to have to cut out pieces, and sometimes cut out pieces that you really loved writing, that you think are really well written, but they're just not a good fit for that chapter or that book. Okay, we'll take them out. I have a whole file with paragraphs and sentences that I cut out of my books that I want to use maybe another time because I think they are well written, or it's a good point, or it's a relevant concept, but not for that book. Right, keep it there. Every now and then go through that file and see if there's somewhere else where you can use it. There's often a lot of good ideas in there. By the way, coming back to this talk about where do you get your ideas. So you rewrite, and eventually it's done, and you get the final draft. Okay, this is when the proofing and editing starts. So that is, you send it out to either people who know what they're doing and have the chops to correct you on spelling mistakes, grammatical mistakes, punctuation, all that kind of stuff. Some people are content editors. They can look at it and say like, the beta readers do a part of it, but a good content editor will say, well, this isn't actually quite clear. Maybe you should clarify this a little bit more, and so on. And then you go through all that process as well. Typically you do content first, and then you go into just basically the dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's when it comes to punctuation, grammar, and so on. You can have it done by people who are really good at that kind of stuff. Normally an English teacher should be good at that kind of stuff, just punctuation and grammar. You can hire somebody. I've used people on Fiverr. Fiverr is a website where you can get relatively cheap a lot of services, amongst them editing and proofing, and they've done a good job. You might have to look for someone, but typically they do a good job. And then eventually, when that process is over, you've got the final document, and this is what's gonna go out. Now, I write in Word. Word is accepted by the Kindle store from Amazon, where I upload most of my books. And that typically works just fine. However, inserting pictures into a Word file, it's not that great in my opinion. Now, Amazon has software that helps you do that. It's called Kindle Create. But you can also pay for services for people who will convert a Word file into an EPUB file. EPUB is the type of file that is often used, or a PDF. That's also possible. And they will then insert the pictures for you and make sure that it's all aligned correctly and it's all well done. This is a step that I would propose you don't skip. Don't just upload the Word file and insert the pictures yourself, because you end up with files that don't read well when it comes to reading them on a Kindle device, or on a cell phone or an iPad, or that when you put it in the paper version, that just the edges don't align, and it's a skill in and of itself. So you should, make sure that stuff is done right. You can hire people to do it. It can be a little bit expensive sometimes, a few $100s. Some ask more. If people charge you thousands of dollars for it, they're ripping you off. Don't spend your money on that. But converting the file to the right format needs to be done. And then you're going to have to end up publishing it. Now, typically I have two publishers that I use, Amazon for the paper version and the ebook version. And then there's also Draft to Digital. Again, the links will be in the show notes. Draft to Digital gets your book in libraries and a bunch of other online retailers that will sell your ebook for you. There's different ways of doing it. You can get the paper version differently. I'm not going to get into these are very technical details, and there's reasons pro, there's reasons against it. For me, I think the easiest is to get to Amazon for the paper version, and it tends to work pretty well. So before you publish, you need a cover. You can get one on Fiverr For some of the stuff that I did, I provided all the pictures and said this is what the cover needs to look like, and I took somebody on Fiverr, and it cost me like 10, 15 bucks or 20 bucks to make a cover. That's not a lot of money. You can go to a site like 99 Designs and have like a contest where you ask people who are designers, like make me a cover and make me a proposal. This is a book. This is what I want to have. This is what I'm looking for, and I'm going to pay $500 to the person who makes the best cover. And then a bunch of people will make an offer with the cover that they make for you. You can pick one. Typically more expensive, but there's some really good work there as well. So when you make a cover, make sure that it's not fancy stuff that is, it looks really cool, but it's a mess, meaning that it's just filled with a bunch of stuff and it's just all over the place. It tends to basically, annoy readers or put them off from buying your book. There's a good website called The Book Designer. I'll put, again, link is in the show notes, where you can find advice on good covers and bad covers, and a lot more, by the way. Next is sales copy. You're going to have to write that. And basically that is when you go, for instance, to Amazon, you click on a book, you see on the left side of the screen, you see the cover, and on the right side, there's sales copy. Ad copy that basically says like, okay, what's the book about? And it's trying to convince you to buy it. This is, again, a skill set in and of itself. You can hire people to do that. But if you write it for yourself, typically you ask yourself, what's in it for the reader? Why would somebody buy your book? What are they going to learn? What are they going to get out of it? What problem do you solve? And so on. So never write about, and you know what I said about never? Never write about, I'm so awesome that you should read my book. I think there's very few people that can get away with that. But what you do want to write is like, okay, what's in it for the person who wants to buy the book? What do you get out of it? What do you win? What do you learn? What are you offering to the reader? Another thing you'll have to add when you upload the book to publishers is the metadata, and that is title, description, author name, or multiple authors. There's different categories. If you look at Amazon, you click on a book, you'll see that there are different categories on top: fiction, non-fiction, crime, and then subcategories and so on. You can choose those to a certain degree, and you have to choose them wisely. You can add keywords so that the online stores know what the book is about, and stuff like that. It's not that difficult, but you're going to have to think about that a little bit. And then once you hit publish for the paper version, specifically on Amazon, you can get a proof copy. So they print one copy, send it to you, and you'll look at it. And it takes a few days to get there typically, and then you look at it and like, okay, what is it that I'm seeing? Is it good? Is everything aligned? Is the quality of the pictures okay? And so on, because you can still make changes at that point. It's not fun, but you can still make changes. And if you notice that, well, no, okay, the edges bleed into the paper, this doesn't work. I'm going to have to reformat it and so on. Or you catch a big mistake, a picture that is in the wrong place, happened to me once, you can fix it then. It's not fun, but you have to do it instead of sending out a crappy product, because readers will not forgive you selling a crappy product where the pictures are just all messed up. They're not going to be happy with that, and they will let you know. So you get a proof copy, and then you approve it, and then it basically gets published. Your book's out there. What I typically do, something that I learned from Lauren, the book is on the table when it arrives. I'm happy. I look at it. I'm like, okay, this is another achievement. This is great. And I bask in the glory of having finished that book and having published it. And then the next day I put it on the shelf, forget about it, and I do the next one. So take a little bit of time to be happy with the fact that you managed to publish a book, because most people don't. A large part of the people who write a book never publish it. They never could get to the point of publication. Whether it's independent or with a publisher, they never get there. Okay, well, you did. So, and if you can do that, then you're ahead of the curve. You're ahead of everybody else, because you just managed to get to that point. So I would celebrate a little bit. Then the work actually starts. You have to market it. Publishers, again, sometimes they do, often they don't really market it other than just putting out a release on their social media and so on, and just showing that, okay, these are the new books we have and yours is one of them. Typically they expect you to do a lot of the promotional stuff as well. So what do? You post stuff on your social media, you make videos on YouTube, Facebook, and so on. If you can go on podcasts where they talk about the subject of your book, where it's in that niche. You can do advertising on social media. You can do all sorts of stuff. That is way beyond the scope of this episode here, but you're gonna have to do some marketing. Don't just expect, it's on Amazon, so people will buy it. It's not how it works. Every now and then, but mostly no. You're gonna have to promote it. Same thing. Be yourself. Don't pretend to be somebody you're not, and don't promote it in a douchebag way where you're, where you're doing this over the top marketing. It works for some people, but if in the long run it tends to backfire. So just be honest in your advertising, and you can be excited about it and be very upbeat and extroverted about your book, but don't lie about it in your commercial work and in your marketing. Just be honest. And what do you do then? It's well, I think the best thing you can do is write your next book. If you want to be a writer and make a living that way, having one book out, unless it's a bestseller, is not going to get you far. So write the next one. I don't know what about. Okay, again, go back to the beginning of the podcast where I talk about where you get your ideas, because your next book will be in many ways easier to write and harder to write, because now you have experience, but you also have some pressure on yourself, like, ooh, do I actually really want to do that, or what will people think, and will it be as good as the first one? Don't listen to that inner critic. Just write the next one and go through the process again. And like they say, trust the process, that you will do the writing and the rewriting and have the beta readers and so on, and eventually get to publish the second one and so on. The big thing about writing is that it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. There's very few writers who have a bestseller as a first book. And there's also a lot of people who only have one book in them. And that's fine. It's hard to make a living that way, but that is fine. And some bestsellers never have a second bestseller. And that's all okay. You just be yourself. Just write to the best of your abilities, and eventually, if your writing is good enough, because not all writing is good. For sure, some of mine isn't good enough to publish. Then if it's good enough and it finds an audience, then you might be able to make a living off that. The biggest thing that I see, like I said, is mindset. It's like, okay, I put all my energy and my sweat, blood and tears in this first book, so what the hell can I write about next? I'm like, there's always something. Look at cookbooks. There are cookbooks coming out by the hundreds every year. It's not as if nobody knows how to cook, and it's not as if there are radically new vegetables being discovered every single day. So there's a lot of this stuff that is old, yet still people write cookbooks every year, loads of them, and people buy them. So don't stress out too much, like, okay, there's nothing left to write about. There is. You just might not see it right away. Okay, give yourself some time, do something else first, and then get back to discovering some ideas. 2 more points. No matter what you do, some people will hate your book. There's nothing you can do about that. And some of them will go out of their way to trash your book online and give bad reviews and so on. That's just part of the game. You don't have to respond to negative comments and reviews. It's just a part of what life is like nowadays, especially on the internet. So just keep on going. Don't give up. And if there's criticism that is valid, use it to make your next book even better. If there's criticism that is just a hater online, just spouting, bile and nonsense, leave it be. There's not much to gain there. Final point that I want to make is that this is a process. It's not an end point when you finish the book. You're always going to change things and tweak your method of writing. Everything that I explained as above, before, is my way of doing things from doing it for many years. But your way might be different, and the way I write has changed over the years, and it will continue to change. Same is going to be true for you. Just kind of have to always fine-tune that process and the method that you use to write and try to make it better. And if you can do that, then you're going to have more success than if you don't. That's my opinion. Right, guys, that's it. This took a lot longer than I anticipated. We're well over an hour now, so I went into a lot of detail. I hope you find this one useful. So for the next one, I'll look at another aspect of trying to earn a living with martial arts and self-defense. In the meantime, obviously, as always, give me feedback and ask questions, and I'll see what I can do. And obviously, always, like, share, subscribe. That makes a huge difference. Okay, take care, everybody. Talk to you next time.